Daddy.
How are you? Are you tired?
Ça va? No.
No? You ready to go?
Hello. Was it you I spoke with over the phone yesterday? Yes, it was, Mrs. Beth. Okay. Hello, Marie-Laure.
Put your feet out, and you're gonna point your toes down to the ground, and then you're gonna flex them up. Yep, and point them down. You have good feet. Beautiful toes. I love working with them just because they're so positive, and it's almost like they don't know any sort of criticism or negativity. They don't even know that it exists in the world. So when you're with them, they're just happy all the time. They're happy, they're joyful. Their personalities are magnetic. And it's really special for me as a dancer to watch them dance, because for them, I see dancing in a completely new way when I watch them, and it's really, really beautiful and special for me to watch. I think we feed off each other's energy, and I have just as much fun as they do. They had me laughing really hard today. When I started looking into creating my own program for special needs children, I started doing a lot of research with specifically Down syndrome, and it led me to Jerome Lejeune. And the more I studied about him and his life and his legacy and everything he was as a person and as a doctor, I was just completely overwhelmed. And I had to know who this person was.
The name of Jerome Lejeune will be forever linked to the discovery of the genetic cause of Down syndrome, or Trisomy 21, which affects several of the youths who were dancing with Keenan Kampa that day.
Mongoloid children. There are at least 50,000 in France. They generally appear in families where the mother conceived after 35. We don't know exactly why.
What used to be called Mongolism is the most widespread genetic anomaly in the world. Marie-Odile Retteret, collaborator with Jerome Lejeune for 40 years, is now one of the great specialists of this anomaly, which was first scientifically described in 1846.
Esquirol
and Seguin had noticed a certain number of patients who resembled each other, as if they were born from the same parents. And some of them knew how to write and read. A few years later, Langdon Down had the bad idea of calling this pathology Mongolism.
People accused the mother and thought it was because the mother had syphilis or that there had been immoral behavior. So these were hidden children, children people were ashamed of, and on top of that, they carried their diagnosis on their face. Most notably, they received no education, were put in the corner, and were called village idiots for a long time.
Feeding on fears and unspoken things, the social stigmatization of people with Down syndrome was still common in the mid-20th century.
We didn't notice anything until after 18 months. I was puzzled. I put the child in front of a mirror and I thought there was a link with trisomy. At the time, we called it Mongolism. Thinking it would help, the doctor referred us to a psychologist who was awful. I asked him if he thought he was a Mongoloid. He told me, yes, ma'am, and he let me leave just like that.
I didn't get news of his anomaly right away. I only heard about it 4 months later. The pediatrician told you, don't tell your wife. She'll figure it out by herself.
It's possible I made an effort to forget what he told me.
So Benoit was several weeks old, and when I fed him or talked to him, I realized he wasn't as awake as his older sister. A saying from my mother, unfortunately, came back to me. Everything's bad in a mongoloid. And that, I don't know why, that was etched in my mind. At the hospital, they explained we could abandon him because he had Down syndrome, but we never thought to do that. We accepted right away, and we wanted to let him live like any other child.
Jerome Lejeune was born in Montrouge in 1926 to a middle-class family versed in Christian faith and classical culture. Passionate about theater, music, and astronomy, he was also a young man prone to empathy for his kind. It was probably after reading Balzac's The Country Doctor, where good Dr. Benecis dedicates himself to serving his fellow human beings, that he found his calling. Father Jacques Sourdoux, medical doctor, ex-researcher, and now scientific expert for the Vatican, studied Jerome Lejeune's scientific career.
He could already see himself as a country doctor, which he liked, because all in all, he was a doctor at heart. That included the necessary interest in the human person, the human aspect of medicine. And so he started off in that field, but he still had to intern in a hospital, and he ended up working in Professor Turpin's service. And by chance, because the position was vacant, Turpin appointed him to work with children with Down syndrome. This was a topic toward which Professor Lejeune, Dr. Lejeune at the time, was not particularly drawn to.
If Jerome Lejeune gave up his calling as a country doctor, it was because he was anxious to settle down. A young lady he met on the benches of the Sainte Geneviève Library held a special place in his heart for the past 2 years. She wasn't the ideal daughter-in-law for Jerome's parents, as she was a Danish Protestant from a very humble background. Respectfully going against his family's disapproval, he still decides to marry her in the spring of 1952.
We got married in Denmark, though it was a small group because we were getting married. We got married at the Catholic Church of Odense, 15 miles from the little town I come from. Then we went back to France and settled down in the old house that belonged to his family.
To this woman who would support him in all his battles, he wrote letters every day he was away from her, for his whole life. In this letter, written a few days before their wedding, he asked her agreement to work with Professor Turpin.
Turpin wants me to work with children with Down syndrome for a year or 2. You know, the little intellectually disabled children. I'm convinced that there is something to be found and that we may improve the lives of thousands of human beings. There are about 10,000 in France alone, if we manage to find why they are like this. It is a fascinating goal that will demand great sacrifice, my dear, but if you agree to live a rather precarious but a just and wholesome life based on that hope, I'm sure we will succeed.
Professor Turpin's insight was correct. Professor Turpin was a very brilliant person. He had been pondering these genetic problems for a long time. He suspected that behind all these visible hereditary disorders, there was a part that had to be more or less linked to chromosomes, but he couldn't prove it. He was ultimately waiting for the people, or the person, or the youth who could continue in his field with more time ahead of him, who could see where things were going. That's when he had the good idea to entrust Jerome Lejeune with these children.
Jerome Lejeune quickly became very interested in these children, whom he received in his consultation room at the Trousseau Hospital. He worked on their dermatoglyphs, the particular folds in the palms of their hands, which allow us to identify Down syndrome as soon as a child is born. He wanted to understand the cause of their disability, which he also suspected was genetic. Until 1956, we thought the human species had 48 chromosomes. But a new technique allowing us to better observe cells brought their number down to 46. Marthe Gauthier, a young pediatric cardiologist interning in the USA, learned a technique that allowed researchers to better decipher cells following the cultivation and preparation of those cells. When she came back to France, she brought this knowledge to Trousseau, where she got a position.
So Mr. Lejeune was in Turpin's service and watched how Marthe Gauthier proceeded. And as always, Mr. Lejeune told her, that's probably not exactly how it should be done.
There was a possibility of separating chromosomes to look at them. Interesting, interesting, and why not? After all, why not try on our little ones? And that was the idea that he came up with.
Jerome Lejeune had an exceptional eye, meaning that with a microscope, he could recognize pieces of chromosomes when others hesitated. Back then, it was as easy to count chromosomes as it was to count spaghetti on a plate.
At the time, he had a very old microscope in which you couldn't see anything. Therefore, pictures had to be taken to study these separated chromosomes.
He invented a photomicroscope which didn't exist at the time. It was Mr. Lejeune who opened the way to taking the first photos of chromosomes cultivated by Marthe Gauthier in Mr. Turpin's service.
1958. If research in human genetics is bubbling madly in Europe, the USA is one step behind. Kurt Hirschhorn, a young American geneticist, was sent to Europe to visit the main labs and develop a summary of current research. He visited Jerome Lejeune in the month of May and wasn't disappointed.
I visited him because he was one of the first people who was studying chromosomes in humans and trying to figure out whether abnormalities in chromosomes were responsible for diseases. So he was an important one to visit among the geneticists in Europe. When we came to visit him, it was the first time I had met him. He was very excited when we walked in, and the reason he was excited, he took me to his small laboratory with a monocular microscope and told me to look down the microscope and tell me how many chromosomes 21 I see in the preparation that he had under the microscope. And I looked and I counted, and I said, there are 3. There should only be 2, but there are 3. He said, absolutely, and this is the first slide made from a child with Down syndrome, and this was the discovery of the trisomy 21.
So, as would any good scientist, he took his data and went to a congress in Montreal.
He was so proud of his picture that he showed it to everyone. So he wrote to me, I showed my picture to so-and-so and so-and-so, who looked at it but was perplexed.
He could have had his discovery stolen 20 times, but it was so outside the understanding of the time. People with Down syndrome had something extra and not something less.
His presentation in Montreal didn't obtain much of a response. He had the karyotype of only one patient. But when he came back, he applied this technique to others, and then the confirmation came. It wasn't just one case anymore, but 5, 6, and so on, and it went from hypothesis to scientific discovery.
He showed it to an English team who seemed extremely interested. And when he came back, he said, I have a feeling they will search in the same direction if we don't hurry up and publish.
After nearly 8 months of fumbling and hesitating with this incredible discovery, Jerome Lejeune hastily convinces Professor Turpin to publish the discovery. It was published on January 26, 1959, in the Reports of the Academy of Sciences, first signed by Lejeune, followed by Gauthier and Turpin. After discovering the genetic origin of trisomy 21, Jerome Lejeune wanted to completely change the image of these children with Down syndrome that he knew and understood like no other. They now flocked in hundreds to his consultation room with their parents.
We learned there was a professor who specialized in these children. So you can imagine, it drove me to tears. Our joy to finally be, that our child finally earned recognition.
There was an understanding between the two characters that was extraordinary. You disappeared completely. They feel when they're loved and when they aren't, and they're very sensitive to that. There was a communication between them, if you will.
He was persuaded that he was in the right and convinced that one day we would find out. He said, of course, they're not disordered patients. They're children who have a problem, sent by nature. But they aren't disordered children in themselves. It's a state. We have a huge number of testimonies from mothers who say, that's when I realized it was my child. He was sick, but people told me about the sickness, so I only saw that, and I didn't see it was my child named Pierre, Paul, Isabel, and that I could love him as he is.
Consulting with his little patients, which he saw every morning at the Necker Hospital, inspired and encouraged Jerome Lejeune in his research, which he dedicated himself to in the afternoon. It was by trying to understand the mechanism of chromosomes that Jerome Lejeune and his team discovered other anomalies, like Cri-du-Chat syndrome, with, as always, the obsession of being able to cure them one day.
He saw on his own, and before anyone saw it and spoke of it, the many possibilities that could develop regarding therapy, regarding care.
In the 60s, Jerome Lejeune was in demand all over the world to jumpstart the teaching of genetics. Appointed UN expert at age 35, he is one of the most well-known geneticists in the world, earning countless awards, including the Kennedy Award, from the hands of the American president. In 1969, the American Society of Human Genetics, headed by Kurt Hirschhorn, decided to award him its highest distinction, the William Allen Memorial Award. He was then at the peak of his career. In October, he traveled to San Francisco to receive his award. The ceremony took place in the prestigious Sheraton Palace. He delivered a speech he had been pondering for several weeks, and it changed his life. Vincent Riccardi, a young graduate student in genetics, saw the ceremony and still remembers 45 years later.
I remember it well because there were two earthquakes. One because the ground shook and the building, the hotel, swayed, but the other one was from Dr. Lejeune. He created an earthquake. The sessions for all of the attendees would have been in the neighborhood of around 200 people. Given Dr. Lejeune's reputation, every seat in the auditorium was full.
For 3 months before the meeting of the American Society of Human Genetics, I was debating with Lejeune to please spend his time talking about his science, but he wouldn't listen to me. He said, no, he wants to talk about something that really bothers him a great deal.
When the future human being is still a conglomerate of cells, apparently not yet differentiated, should we consider him as a human being or not? Should we reject this cell mass if it does not fit our specifications? Or should we respect him and protect him in all possible ways? Such a question, directly raised by the possible detection of a chromosomal error in a young embryo, has to be faced by human geneticists.
doivent maintenant la regarder en face.
When Jerome Lejeune gave this speech, abortion was already decriminalized in several American states for cases when embryonic anomalies were genetically identified. But upon what chromosomal standards can one decide if an embryo has the right to live or not, he asks. If one wants to go down that road, then the National Institute of Health should be complemented by a National Institute of Death, in charge of selecting and eliminating non-compliant embryos, he says, pushing logic to its apex.
He called it the National Institute of Death because the research that was being done caused a number of women to have abortions if they had an abnormal fetus in them.
There were two of us, two types of responses. One type was dumbfounded. Oh my God, what is he saying? What is he telling us? And then there were some others of us who said, wow, this is really great. This is someone who is, as we say in English, calling a spade, who is saying, you know, this is not just chromosome analysis. This is employing chromosome analysis to affect the life of a person.
Some people were still polite and applauded after the end, but a number of them got up and said boo, and you know, and were very upset with the speech, which is why I had to get up and calm them down.
This speech had the effect of a bomb being dropped. Each attendee seemed to hear it in a totally different way. A fascinating scientific argument for some, and inflexible religious opinion for others.
As far as he was concerned, abortion is a sin because that's the teaching of his church, of the Roman Catholic Church, and therefore he is very disturbed that his discovery is going to be responsible for a number of abortions, and he repeated that several times during his speech.
Professor Lejeune never ventured in the theology zone. It's not his field. There is nothing, no quote from the Bible, nothing religious in this speech.
We're doing a laboratory investigation to identify certain results, which results lead to the death of the person who owned those, who was represented by those cells. It seems pretty scientific to me.
From a scientific point of view, what allows you to tell me that I am allowed to destroy a human embryo at this level? And that's what he wants us to think about.
A little while later, on the plane to Paris, in his diary, Jerome Lejeune looks back on his speech defending the human embryo. He had tears in his eyes when he wrote these lines.
Protecting the disinherited, what a reactionary, retrograde, fundamentalist, and inhuman idea. It became clear when in San Francisco, after my rundown on the nature of mankind for the William Allen Memorial Award, the crowd opened up for me silently, letting me pass without a word or a handshake. I know very well, and did in advance, that the scientific world would not forgive such an impertinence. To be nonconformist to the point of still believing in Christian morals, and to see how fully they coincide with modern genetics, that is too much. If chromosomes ever had a chance of earning the Nobel Prize, I knew I just lost it when I gave that warning.
He decided to take a stand, and he knew at that moment that he would lose everything he built.
Bonsoir.
Good evening. Our opening topic of this evening is the children who aren't like others.
Que nous avons donné ce soir au dossier que nous allons ouvrir ensemble.
In 1970, the abortion debate reaches France. A draft bill brought in by Dr. PIERRE offers to allow so-called prophylactic abortion for embryos identified as having disabilities.
I have heard of prophylactic abortion, and I would like to ask what you call prophylactic.
Prophylaxis is preventing an infection. For instance, from a medical point of view, vaccines are delivered in a prophylactic way. And in the present case, a pregnancy is terminated to avoid the birth of a malformed child.
This man asked a specific question, and he was perfectly right. Prophylactic does not mean killing the patients, and it never will. Yet if you tell a geneticist, examine this child's chromosomes, and if they are abnormal, I will eliminate him, you are asking us very clearly to play Pontius Pilate's role and to wash our hands of what people will do afterwards. Well, no, we are doctors. I do not speak from a scholar's chair. I am talking about children who are made of flesh and bones, and I do not want to kill these children because they are patients.
We can honestly ask ourselves if there is anything worse for a man who is a scientist, a discoverer, than realizing his discovery will completely clash with his beliefs. The inner debate must be something absolutely terrifying.
There are probably little ones with Down syndrome who are 10, 15 years old, and who are listening to us and who understand us despite what you think, and who couldn't possibly believe that you could suggest to eliminate children who resemble them. As a doctor, I will not let you tell them that.
The next morning, parents came into the examination room with a boy who must have been 10 or 14. And he came up and said, "I saw on TV they're going to kill us, and you are my doctor, and you have to defend me." When Jerome came home for lunch, he said, "He's right. I am their doctor, and I have to speak up against this law."
That's when we saw the moment when man takes over material issues and human issues, etc. It was his soul that decided to stand up. He also said, "I know it's already a lost battle, but all the time we gain is time for these children to live."
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It is quite difficult to talk about the problem of abortion without letting one's personal opinion show. Yet it's what we should try to do in order to remain neutral before the debate in Parliament, which promises to be stormy.
The PIERRE law, which Jerome Lejeune fought against, did not pass. But 4 years later, an expanded draft bill is brought in, deeply dividing society. Jerome Lejeune rises to the front of the line again in the name of medicine and the Hippocratic Oath.
The battle our opponents lead is the battle of hypocrisy, the battle of the minority. In more than half the world, abortion is freely carried out. It seems that only the French fetus deserves such a battle which is improperly called a battle for the respect of life.
Like any doctor, I am for life. I am made to protect and never to kill. You see, I believe that what protects children is not the law, it's not the police, it's not judges, it is the love of parents and the respect of society. So I'm certain of one thing, the love of parents will not pass away, but the respect of society might pass away if society is crazy enough to authorize the elimination of some of its members.
In this battle, people spoke out in several waves. There were the doctors for the respect of life, which was a huge petition and a huge movement. Then we had taken over with the legal advisors for the respect of life. Then there were mayors, state council members, and the elected representatives for the respect of life. These were petitions that gathered 15 or 20,000 people, so we weren't very far from succeeding. Well, impartially, if Pompidou hadn't died, this law wouldn't have passed. I think with his clever mind, he knew he wouldn't win. But that didn't keep him from always being the man leading the battle, and who led it after that too. I can say it now. He was the boss, you know. He was the one you went to see. He was the one who gave us the orders to give. He was the one who calmed the excited ones down and who shook up the listless ones. He was also the one who did all the public appearances on radio and TV, until they stopped inviting him because he was too good.
Alors, Monsieur Lejeune, je suis avec vous.
So, Mr. Lejeune, I am completely on your side when you defend in utero life, but defend it on every level. We have to have created places for your monstrous children, for the families who have no home, and for the contamination of the atmosphere by bombs, which we know, as Mr. Kessler said, that they are ridiculous. So we must choose. Yes, we must choose between decrepitude and youth.
I am very interested in what you said, because you said we have to choose between decrepitude and youth. To choose youth, you offer to kill it as it begins. It doesn't make sense. You say you're against the death penalty for the guilty, and I'm totally ready to follow you on that. And yet, you want to reinstate it for innocent people. You have then said that a child in its mother's womb is not innocent. You said it could be an attacker. That's not true. It's not an attacker. It's possible that, given the mother's state, a certain disorder may make the pregnancy very difficult in certain possible cases. It's possible, but what you call the attacker is in fact the sickness the mother has. It isn't the child.
In the rather left-wing or libertarian circles that I was part of, Jerome Lejeune was clearly an enemy. He was an enemy of the emancipation of women. He was someone who fought to forbid abortion. He also demonstrated against contraception, because for him it was a preliminary debate necessary to try to stop the abortion debate.
It's a time we forgot, but it was extremely violent. And that's when we received those anonymous, unpleasant phone calls about my father. I was with my sister Karen, and I saw, painted in red on the walls of the university, "Kill Lejeune and his little monsters." I had gone to the university to pick up his car, and all 4 tires had been punctured. I also remember the demonstrations in the Mutualité Center, which were extremely violent, where people didn't let him speak. People threw something at him from the chair. I don't know if it was liver or something to look like an aborted baby, but he wasn't afraid.
There were also the media attacks against Lejeune. Articles in the Canard enchaîné accusing him of distorting his teachings in favor of his personal opinion.
And especially his friends, his closest friends, separated from him, saying, "You're going too far." I think that was the hardest part for him, that even his close friends, his doctor friends, distanced themselves from him, and at some point he thought he might not be able to continue his research in France.
In these troubled times, Jerome Lejeune's obsession to find a cure for trisomy 21 as fast as possible pushed him to undertake research that few believed in, including his team. His fight against abortion also created a gap between him and the scientific world, which he sometimes emphatically criticized and who would make him pay for it.
It brought him to a very tough position regarding those who did not share this angle, but who instead went by the eugenic angle and decided there were no lectures to be had from Lejeune. I know at some point I had been invited to a dinner where there were supposed to be several important people from the medical world who were very fiercely pro-abortion. The person who invited me said, "Well, listen, you can come, but for them, you're the devil." Then I said, "I'm the devil because I was Paul Touvier's lawyer, because it was right after the Touvier trial, leader of the militia." He said, "Not at all, not at all. It's because you're Professor Lejeune's friend." It was worse. So I said, I'm astounded.
Alors là, j'ai dit, alors là, je suis sidéré, quoi.
We both ended up just like we started, but it left a horrible void, and there were no more funds from the National Institute of Health and Research, nor from anything.
It was sad because he ended up almost alone, and he had to finish his career, in my opinion, not very pleasantly.
Jerome Lejeune was ostracized on a worldwide level. He was no longer invited to the big genetics congresses where he used to be the star, and he ended up very isolated. But at the same time, the doors of the Vatican opened for him. In 1974, he was appointed expert at the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, which keeps the Pope aware of important scientific topics.
He was very happy to have been appointed by Paul VI to the Pontifical Academy of Sciences. It was one of the titles he found the most important. Then Paul VI passed away shortly after he met Jean-Paul II, who wanted to meet the members of the Academy. They had lunch together, and I don't know if it's the right word, but it was sort of like love at first sight, on both sides. It was a sharing of both faith and intelligence.
Even though they had different paths, the perspective was the same, and each acknowledged in the other someone who was going towards something he held close at heart.
I think what Jean-Paul II admired in my father was that he was a scientific man of faith. He would confront my father for scientific accuracy and then be able to decide the Church's position.
I met Professor Lejeune when we were conducting the second Congress for the Family. The first one was in Guatemala and the second one was in Mexico. And he came as a speaker. We invited him to be our speaker because His Holiness John Paul II told me that in his opinion, Professor Lejeune was one of the most intelligent people he had ever met.
That's the piano. I like music, and I'll play walks on Sundays. Marie-Laure did follow a normal school curriculum until 9th grade, sort of step by step. She sort of followed the syllabus, so she learned how to read very well. Counting was a little more difficult because it's abstract. She finished school with what we call a CFG, a General Education Certificate. So after that, she could sign up in a professional course. She took correspondence courses. It allowed her to have a more flexible school life, and it wasn't as difficult, so she could have some activities in addition to school. Now I'll hug my brother, my sister, and my parents.
In the late 80s, an American legal case in Maryville, Tennessee, allowed Jerome Lejeune to leave a true scientific legacy on the beginning of human life. A divorcing couple, the Davises, were arguing over the frozen embryos they conceived during their marriage. The wife wanted to give birth to them, but the husband refused. Judge Young requested the advice of scientists to know if these embryos were human persons subject to custody rights, or if they were objects that could be disposed of. Martin Palmer, a young pro-life lawyer, heard of this case and immediately thought of Jerome Lejeune. He called him up on a beautiful day in August 1989 to explain the case.
He said, "But what say the mother?" I said, "Well, she has told the judge that if he will not give these embryos to her for implantation, donate them anonymously to any woman who cannot have children so that their children might live. The husband told the wife privately that if he got his hands on the embryos, he would destroy them. Dr. Lejeune thought a moment. He said, "This is incredible. This is the judgment of Solomon. I did not think it could reoccur in human history, but it's reoccurring." And he flew to the US at his own expense and testified in that case.
I said, "Who is this fella?" Next thing I know, in about 4 days, they've flown into our airport here in town, Knoxville, and I cheated and looked him up a little bit. So when I sat down, we had at least an hour talk. We went down to the breakfast area and we talked for about an hour. I said, "Well, who do you serve?" And he said, "I serve my king." Well, I knew he meant Jesus Christ. And so I said, "And you're a Catholic and you believe that?" He said, "Yes, sir." I said, "Okay, sir, then I'm saying, yes, sir, you're going to be my star witness." The witnesses against us were from all over the United States. Every one of them said, "No, an embryo has nothing. It's not human, it's not," and these are not even embryos, they're pre-embryos. They gave it a special name, pre-embryo.
Under American law, there was no question that a pre-embryo was not considered a human being. That was clear from rulings of the United States Supreme Court, particularly Roe versus Wade, the abortion decision from the 70s. Basically, his position at trial was that a pre-embryo is a human being, and that it didn't matter whether it was, 4 cells or 10 trillion cells. My cross-examination of him ended up with me showing him a chicken egg. I held up and said, "Professor Lejeune, can you tell me what this is?"
And he said, "Without further or closer examination, I'd say that's a chicken egg."
And I said, "Oh, I thought you would tell me it was an early chicken."
And he says, "Well, like I said, under closer examination, if that egg is indeed fertilized, it's going to be a chicken."
Judge Young, very impressed by Jerome Lejeune's testimony, ended up acknowledging the embryo status as human beings for the first time in legal history and entrusted them to the mother. But his judgment was revoked when the father appealed it and took the case to the Supreme Court, which resulted in the embryos being destroyed. In Maryville, Jerome Lejeune testified as a geneticist to state that human life starts with the very first cells when the genetic code of a new and unique being is created. His opponents accused him again of giving a religious opinion, not a scientific one. This debate occupied Jerome Lejeune's whole life. When does human life start, according to science?
From the scientific medical point of view, human life begins when the offspring is capable of surviving out on its own. So that's why the law in the Supreme Court that was passed said 24 weeks.
It's probably because I'm a geneticist that I say this, but given our current knowledge, it's irrefutable to think that an individual is an individual from the moment he has his gene pool. In other words, from the moment the gene pool of the ovocyte and the spermatozoan's gene pool merge, and at that moment, the individual's life program is initiated.
You believe in that, then what you have to believe also is that if you take some cells from your skin and culture them and you see that they're chromosomes and the cell is moving and so on, does that mean that it is the same as the life of a person? No. It's just that every cell, until it dies, is alive independently.
Oui, mais ce sont des cellules.
Yes, but those are cells that, once isolated from the body, cannot develop and have a life program as we know it.
Et d'avoir le programme d'une vie telle que nous les connaissons.
It's a living program, but it's not a life program.
Mais ça n'est pas un programme d'une vie.
Je pense
I think a large number, I don't know how many, because it's difficult to tell, but a rather large number of the children who cannot get efficient treatment at this time will be cured in a few years. To accept that, currently, due to a little scientific breakthrough allowing us to detect the disorder at the beginning of a life, to sacrifice this life would be to not believe in science. We can't imagine that research is over, that everything's already been discovered.
This is the most amazing event of the year. This is our annual convention, and here in Indianapolis, it's our 42nd convention, where we'll have about 3,300 people participating. Families, professionals, educators, a great group of exhibitors, and probably our favorite part of those attendees are our 300 self-advocates, people with Down syndrome who are age 15 and up, who are attending their own conference within our general convention.
What you're doing. No, your name's not on here. This is Friday, July 11, Kids Camp Session 2.
This is my 7th or 8th convention. I've kind of lost track over the years. Basically just came to learn as much as I could about how to help her reach her full potential and all the things we could be doing at home with her.
Today, the social integration of people with Down syndrome is improving little by little in the USA. Just like young Riley, more and more children study. Some autonomous adults live alone and have fulfilling jobs. Though these improvements are still in their infancy, they show the evolution of society's point of view regarding these people whose life expectancy has leapt in half a century from 10 to 60 years.
I think the National Down Syndrome Congress Convention really is an injection of happiness, and it's just a renewal for all of our spirits. You come here and it's like one big family. You run into colleagues, you run into friends, you run into people with Down syndrome and their family members, and instantly things feel normal. Everyone has the same value system, everyone is excited, everyone sees people with Down syndrome as more alike than different.
Trisomy 21 is the most widespread chromosomal anomaly. Detected before birth, it leads to abortion in over 90% of cases in France, yet its research is the least funded by the government. For years, Jerome Lejeune was one of the few to actively search for treatments. Since the 2000s, the Lejeune Foundation continues his work, funding research that is now blossoming. So much so that some research centers are now launching their first clinical trials. We joined Dr. Brian Skotko in his research center in Boston. He is the brother of a sister with Down syndrome, and he launched, within the hospital, a department entirely dedicated to the medical monitoring of people with Down syndrome. Like Patrick, they come in dozens every month to test the future treatments.
Patrick? How are you?
Good.
Thanks so much for coming.
Yeah.
How have you been?
Good.
Excellent. All right, I'm going to start by listening to your heart, and then we'll go to your lungs. Okay?
Okay.
Many decades ago, people said, well, what can you do with Down syndrome? It's a whole extra chromosome, and how can you eventually come up with a therapeutic approach to Down syndrome as an entity. But now, the mysteries of Down syndrome are starting to be unlocked. We're starting to learn, what do those genes on chromosome 21 do? And is there a way for us to be able to change or alter those in a way that would maximize the life potential of people with Down syndrome?
So now we're in a position to target that gene, to turn the gene down a little bit, or to enhance the processing of that protein so we eliminate the problems. That's a breakthrough that we're very excited about. Another breakthrough is in the area of cognition. Could we learn how it is that the circuits of the brain malfunction to make it difficult to learn, remember, to speak? We're getting closer and closer to that. Things are going very fast now. Children with Down syndrome alive today will have therapeutic options in the future for the first time.
I'm going to have you hold up one finger and touch my finger and touch your nose. And touch my finger and touch your nose. Awesome. Awesome. So there have been many giants in the book about Down syndrome, and a significant chapter, if not multiple chapters, is Jerome Lejeune. You know, in many ways, the hallmark of 1959, when we discovered that an extra chromosome is what causes Down syndrome, was a start of an epic, a start of a discovery, a start of a research odyssey. And in many ways, the same thrill, the same excitement of looking through that microscope and discovering that extra 21st chromosome for the first time still exists here in the halls of Massachusetts General Hospital, where we're doing clinical drug trials and we're discovering things for the first time. And all of this was done with the same spirit that Jerome Lejeune had, and that is, how do we make tomorrow better for people with Down syndrome? Great job. Excellent. Well, it's great to have you be a part of the study.
Yep.
Thank you for participating.
Yes, your pleasure.
On April 3, 1994, on Easter Day, Jerome Lejeune died of cancer in Paris. He was 67 years old.
It was a great loss for me because, after all, he took care of the boy. And it wasn't only him. There were also all the other youth. It's difficult, you know. Well, I was... And I... Well, it was tough.
We lived through his illness, which was very short since he actually died in 5 months. With that, he gave us peace, but he was especially sad for his little patients because they won't understand why I'm leaving them.
That is why soon after Professor Lejeune's death, we, together with his family and friends, decided to set up the Jerome Lejeune Foundation as an answer to the anguish of his family and patients, so that they would no longer feel abandoned, and to continue Professor Lejeune's work in the fields of medicine, science, and the respect for life.
I was very, very influenced by Dr. Lejeune and the talk he gave in 1969. As many occasions that I assisted a family in the decision to terminate a pregnancy, I assisted them with some pain. And the source of that pain was the logic, the science of Dr. Lejeune's talk in 1969. But it's a very difficult decision to take a life based on results from the laboratory. And I think what Dr. Lejeune did was to make those of us who were in that kind of leadership position understand that there was an element of agony for everybody involved.
Dr. Jerome Lejeune was the identifier of the extra chromosome found in trisomy 21, the cause of Down syndrome. But he was much more than that. He was a scientist through and through. He was the best of science. He would not compromise on that. But he also understood that because of that science, you also had to have a responsibility to the human person.
It's not religious, it's not any type of faith, it's understanding human life. And when you understand human life and you value it that way, I mean, the man was incredible, and he did everything right, and all he did was try to stick up for the people that couldn't defend themselves.
He was what I would call a chosen human being, one that you would meet, and you may go through tens of thousands. But this guy had favor. And so in my opinion, he was like an apostle. He was like a disciple. And he was serving his king.
The French scientist who discovered the chromosome that causes Down syndrome can now be referred to as venerable. Pope Francis is recognizing the heroic virtues of Jerome Lejeune. It is one of the requirements for beatification in the Catholic Church. Another is a verified miracle.
Alors il se trouve
It so happens that we are faced with a formidable dilemma.
absolument redoutable.
Technique is cumulative. Wisdom is not.
Est cumulative.
We will become more and more powerful,
La sagesse
therefore more and more dangerous.
Nous serons
Alas,
de plus en plus
we do not
puissants,
become
donc de plus en
wiser.
plus dangereux.
What will
Nous ne
people
devenons
who
pas de
do
plus en
this
plus
for a
sages.
living, like me, do
Qu'est-ce que les
to
gens
know
dont c'est le métier,
whether this
comme
must
moi,
be done or this
pourront faire
mustn't
pour
be done?
savoir ceci
We
doit
need
être
a point
fait,
of reference,
ceci doit être
and perhaps
refusé.
a point of
Il
reference
faut
more
bien que nous ayons
powerful
une référence,
than the
et même une
natural
référence
law
encore
I was
beaucoup plus
speaking
forte
of
que la loi
earlier.
naturelle dont je vous parlais
This
tout à l'heure.
reference is very
Et
simple.
cette référence, elle est
You
très
all
simple.
know it.
Vous la
And
connaissez
it can be
tous.
summed up in one word.
Elle se
In one
résume
phrase,
en un mot,
actually, but one phrase
dire,
that changes
en une
everything,
phrase,
that explains
mais
everything,
une phrase
that
qui
contains
juge tout,
everything.
qui explique tout.
And this phrase is simply enunciated.
Et cette phrase
Whatever
dit
you did to the
simplement,
least of these, my
ce que
brothers
vous
and
avez fait
sisters, you did to
au
me.
plus petit d'entre les miens, c'est à moi que vous l'avez fait.